Welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk, insights, interviews, and practical tips on the teachings of the Buddha for people of all walks of life, attuning, exploring, integrating the teachings in everyday life. Simple Dhamma for daily life. I'm Asoka, hosting Dhamma Capsule for people like you. Hello and welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk. This is episode number 4, and today I'm in conversation with Caroline at Amaravati Buddhist Monastery. Good afternoon, Caroline.
Good afternoon.
Caroline, if I understand correctly, you have been a lay long-term resident at Amaravati Buddhist Monastery for about 19 years.
Yes.
Did you always serve in the similar capacity? Or have you moved from one department to another? If you could give a bit of an outlook, what does it mean to stay behind the scenes of running a monastery?
I've been involved with the Sangha since about 1987, and eventually I decided that I would really like to be closer to Amaravati. And when I came, I'd already known quite a lot of the monks and nuns. So when I came, I didn't actually have a role. And I tried out a couple of things where there were vacancies. But Ajahn Chandasiri, who was effectively my mentor at that time, suggested I become the librarian. She probably knows I read a lot of books, or I did. So first of all, I did that.
But were you already acquainted with Buddhism, and in Theravada Buddhism in particular, or were you just, say, a beginner's mind, someone who was just attracted to it and just bumps into some monks, ordained or not ordained, and decided to explore? Or did you have an understanding of Buddhism or an approach to Buddhism already, or practice?
In the 1980s, so we're talking a long time ago.
40 years.
I was looking for a spiritual path because I realised that I really needed one. And a friend of mine was as well. So we tried various things, actually. We just went on a tour of what was available.
In the UK?
In the UK. And eventually I chanced upon, through a friend of mine, Theravada Buddhism at Harnham, the Harnham Buddhist Monastery. And I was involved there even after I moved to Amaravati. So we could say that I was involved with Harnham from 1987 to 2009.
So could you give, for those who don't know, could you give very brief outline of how many monasteries there are and the dates, a bit of chronological history there? Would you mind a little bit?
I don't mind.
Have you been
to get the ducks lined up? But yes, in this group of monasteries, in the Ajahn Chah Forest monasteries, as they're known, that are part of the Elders' Council, supported by the European Elders' Council and Wat Pa Pong, etc., which is a monastery in Thailand. There are Chithurst, Amaravati, Harnham, and Hartridge.
In the UK.
Harnham is also known as Aruna Ratnagiri.
Which means, in Pali?
The Ratnagiri is the jewel on the hill. And I can't remember what the Aruna is. It was acquired after my time, actually.
Yeah, Giri is the abode. And
yes.
Anyway, so you were attracted to Harnham.
Yes.
And you went.
Yes.
Which is, if I'm correct, towards Scotland, on the border with Scotland. Or is it already in Scotland?
No, it's in Northumberland.
Northumberland, okay.
Half an hour drive north of Newcastle.
Okay, good. You went, but you had a job at that time, did you?
I did.
A so-called normal routine, and then you would spend the rest of your hobby time exploring life in monasteries.
Yes. At that time, Harnham was a very small and quiet monastery in a rented building. There was one building that had been bought and a rented building, but we managed to have retreats there. And all my early retreats were at Harnham. And I just thought they were fantastic way of exploring the mind. And I remember some of them quite well now. So, yeah.
And that we're talking about a Sangha, I would say, the birth of a Sangha in the UK. I mean, there had been some ordained. Chithurst started in the late 70s, right? So it's just about 10 years into the history of the Achan Chah tradition being based in the UK. And there were already 3 monasteries in that time. Oh, already 4?
There might have been 4.
Already.
Hartridge was half given to the EST, which is the steward body for Amaravati and Chithurst, and half to what was called the Devon Vihara Trust. And I think that they all popped up fairly early on.
So keep going.
So yeah, I was working in jobs, and I started doing something for the monastery. I think my first role at all in terms of offering something was organising a retreat. I mean, having been on retreats, that seemed an obvious thing to do. And so I did that. And after a few years, I joined the equivalent of a little management group that looks after the monastery day after day. But the old gentleman who owned the big house next door, who we also rented property off, was old, and I can't remember if he's actually died, but we thought we better have a development plan. As people who were
We're
involved
still talking
there,
about Northumberland.
yes. The abbot, who was Ajahn Menindo by then. So he and I and a few other people contributed, and we put together a development plan just to have a shared view of what we would do if the old chap next door died. Because we didn't want the property sold on the open market and the place become full of noisy people. So we would try to buy the property, and then we could influence who it was sold to, because it would be too big for us to keep. So that was the first time that I did anything using any of my professional voluntary sector development skills, you would call it, for a monastery.
And always doing your normal job. And that meant leaving. Where were you actually based for your job? In London?
No. After I graduated from Newcastle University, I stayed in Newcastle. And by that time, I was working with the City Council, doing grant aid and development things for voluntary organisations.
You sound like really you were put on a trail already.
Yes, so I was already on that boat. But I also had started training as a psychosynthesis psychotherapist.
Psychosynthesis therapist.
Yes.
So that goes into counselling, mediation?
That was a form of psychotherapy with a spiritual base that had been actually developed by an Italian man called Assagioli. Okay. In England, it's classed as an integrative psychotherapy rather than an analytical psychotherapy.
Yeah. I will explore.
But the thing that's, I think, important for trying to sort of integrate it with right view and other things in Buddhist practice is that it has a spiritual foundation. So it has intrinsic to it that human beings are spiritual beings, and that realization or healing or whatever you'd like to call it is a normal, natural thing for a human mind to.
So finding yourself, it was a very fertile ground, basically, finding yourself. I mean, you were looking for it, staying into coming closer to Theravada. From what I understand, you've always been close to Theravada, or you have explored as well other traditions in Buddhism, but the one that you know the most and you've lived with since then has been the Theravada and forest tradition in particular.
Yes.
And so it sounds as though you were integrating all aspects or between your aspirations and your choices, your pathway. And then what happened then? Hanem over and over, or
by the end of the 90s, my job in local government had changed and didn't sustain the heart anymore, partly because of the very extreme cuts that local government experienced in the 90s. I was more and more interested in psychotherapy and the practice. But I kept up the job because the job helped, and I liked the job. It was good work, right livelihood and all of that.
So continuing on the grant fund,
yes,
management, project management. Yeah.
But by the early 2000s, I spent the Millennium Evening, when it ticked over from 1999 to 2000. I spent that at Hartridge. I was already spending a lot of time at Hartridge, which was the monastery in Devon, because the nuns at that time had Hartridge as a nuns only monastery.
So we're talking about the Siladhara nuns in this case. We're talking about Siladhara's nuns.
Yes.
So the year 2000 or so, the monastic communities comprised of bhikkhus and Siladharas, and the Siladharas were spread, in Chitha, between Chitha, Amaravati, and Hardridge, or how was the scene at that time in those years?
The nuns had started at Chithurst because that was the first monastery, and then when Amaravati opened in 1984, a group of them came to Amaravati. I think they walked.
They walked, yeah. There's a history, story about that, yeah.
So at that point there were two places for the nuns to go, and some of the nuns felt that they would like to try being more independent in an all nuns monastery. Not with all the nuns, as I'm saying, but just nuns.
How many nuns are we talking about here?
So I think at that time,
more than 10,
the
15,
nuns,
20?
The nuns community has always had difficulties getting above 16 or 17 Siladhara. And at that time, I think there were 4 plus an Anagarika living at Hartridge.
Would you translate Anagarikas for those who don't know the term?
So if you want to go forth, i.e. be ordained as a nun, you first of all live a few months at least with the community as a lay woman. Then you might take the 8 precepts in the form of being an Anagarika. And so the 5 precepts are the 5 basic moral precepts that all Buddhists are encouraged to adhere to follow. But there are an additional 3 for people who are seriously interested in the practice, I would say, because they're renunciant. So they include giving up all forms of sexual behaviour.
And 1 meal per day.
Yes, plus breakfast, but yes.
Breakfast because it's a cold climate. But there are stories there, or how much they would. I think it was the one of, I heard that some of the bhikkhu talking that it was in this case Rampo Viradamo, who is now in Canada. He was saying that they were even already first, are we actually allowed to have breakfast?
Yes.
Yeah, are we allowed to have flip-flops, shoes and socks? Because the weather in England is obviously of a different type than the one in Thailand. So breakfast, but in terms of meal is usually once a day only, or at least before noon.
From the bhikkhu's point of view, if you can see the lines on the palm of your hand, then you can consider it daylight.
Interesting, yeah.
So then you can eat. The new day is born.
And if the food is beyond the arm's length, you can't take it.
No.
Yeah.
So yes. Anyway, going back
Yeah.
to the Siladhara
Yeah.
or Anagarika. So generally, a woman
16.
would live on those 8 precepts for a couple of years at least. Used to be longer sometimes, and then perhaps going forth, take ordination as a Siladhara.
Mm-hmm. You said that some of them lived at Chithurst, some of them came to Amaravati, and a bunch of them were staying at Hardwich. That's basically
in the 90s.
in
That
the
was
90s.
late 90s. Yes,
And
that was true.
Okay. And in the meantime, where were you? So you were still working, you were doing your practices,
Yeah.
your studies. Did you actually practice as well as a psychotherapist, or were you just in addition? Wow, that's a lot.
It was a lot. When I look back on it,
yes,
I think, wow.
I make you travel backwards. Yeah, I know. There are those years, and we don't seem to think that time is it's very stretchable. There's a lot of hours in a day, but it doesn't feel like. We just naturally flow with it. Yes. And then you're basically, if I understand correctly, you had your job, and then on the side, this spiritual life filled basically every single other moment of your life, including physically and geographically, because you were actually spending physical time in those retreats and helping.
Yes.
But still living on your own, still living, having your own home and making your own, basically your own choices as well. Or were you also, as a person with integrity to the practice, did you also follow the precepts outside when you were not at the monastery? So were you also keeping that discipline for yourself? Or
I would have been on the 5 precepts, but occasionally I would have probably had alcohol, which some lay people do on the basis that, strictly speaking, the precepts are about not being under the influence, you could say.
Yes.
So, yes, Ajahn Amaro doesn't hold to that at all, and I think, yes, it's a bit soppy.
So what happens after? How does this whole path evolve from the year 2000s? Because there also have been changes in the size of the sanghas. There's been movements in and out.
The nuns gave up Partridge early this century. I can't remember the exact date.
Giving up means
that they gave it back to the bhikkhus, effectively.
Right. Okay.
As a place for bhikkhus to live. And then it was empty for a little while, and then Ajahn Jutindro went down to be the abbot from Amaravati. And he's still there. Probably we're getting into 2002, and I'm feeling I think I'd resigned from my main job, and I'd got a job with a group working on domestic violence policy that I had nurtured over several years.
And that's for a governmental organization or NGO?
Well, it was I set it up as a charity with some other colleagues, so that it would have the independence that we felt it should need. But it was based on partnership working. So a lot of the people around the table, when it met, being police officers, probation officers, women's aid, advice workers of one sort or another.
Interesting. So you and then still your hobby was still monastery and spiritual life. So that was nourishing. Must have been a very listening to you, I hear like a lot of complementarity in how you've done. So there's a sort of wholeness of everything you've done has always come into a similar container with just different little pods in it.
Yes.
Interesting.
I think that's true, and I think it's one of the main themes is that I was interested in individual change and social change running in parallel, and how they influenced each other. And my degree was in sociology and social policy, so that supported that. But it was an abiding interest to me, and I think of it now as the chicken and the egg issue, which comes first.
Yeah, I hear a lot of integrity as well. I mean, into all when you seems like all your pieces were part of a similar puzzle. And may I ask you, have you ever thought about ordaining after all these? We're talking about here almost almost 20 years. You started with mid-80s and we are now talking about
Yes.
mid-20s, mid-2000s, sorry. So,
2000s.
yeah. So,
I did.
I
And
won't be surprised, yeah.
several nuns discouraged me.
Uh-huh.
So I felt, oh, they've discussed it and decided that it's not a good idea
I've heard
for
it.
various reasons.
I've heard other persons
Mm.
in other continents, in other,
Mm.
in similar settings, but in other places, who were like considering it and have been discouraged. And I'm very curious about the reasoning behind that. Did you get any clues about that?
When I moved into Amaravati, I was nearly 50. And the nuns do have a cut-off line of 50. So it could have been to do with that. But other things were said, like that I had a very useful role anyway with the Sangha. I was already very well established in my connections with the Sangha, including, with both the bhikkhus and the nuns. So, yeah.
Part of the family.
Yes.
And it's interesting point, because eventually that's also what I heard from another person, not here, and that knowing how the mutual support is established or was established by the Buddha, when it in this tradition, at least the way it's also continued to be established this way, that there is a mutual support between the lay Sangha and the monastic Sangha, considering the fact that the monastic Sangha is not allowed to handle money. It's not, they have to relinquish a number of very down-to-earth responsibilities that are usually in daily life, such as money and driving and cooking, and even changing the spot of a plant. They can't uproot plants from one location and putting it somewhere else. So all these responsibilities are usually taken care of by a lay person. So there is this mutual support. And but then at Amaravati, how Amaravati developed, it's also one very large monastery. You were becoming more and more importantly connected with I guess also the way I see it, from having been outside the UK and the development of the Sanghas of in the Ajahn Chah tradition, there's been a exponential growth, I would say, of Amaravati in terms of the number of the monastics, in terms of the monastery itself. And I think at those years still Alwan Posumedo was the abbot, right, in the year 2000. He was...
in a sense, the numbers haven't grown that much because there are no extra bed spaces.
There are no extra bed, yeah. But there's ordination happening. It's growing, but the Sangha keeps... It's a moving ground.
That's
but
right.
It's still a stable number of... We're still talking about 40 nuns and monastics together.
Yes.
So there was a requirement of looking after the requisites of food and shelter and financial aspects. And
so Ajahn Sumedho's initial conception of it was that Chithurst would continue as the name Chitta Viveka implies, as sanctuary for the heart, or place for the heart. And it's in the country, and it's not as accessible as Amaravati. Amaravati is much easier to get to for people from London.
Right.
And so the site was chosen with that in mind. So Amaravati has always been intended to be a public interface.
Public interface, that's a good way of putting it, yes.
And it's had a retreat centre right from the beginning.
Right.
Which none of the other monasteries had at that time, although Harnham has a facility now.
And how has it been, the articulation of the retreat centre at Amaravati has been established around the year 2000 as well. And how has it been, the articulation?
The retreat centre.
The retreat centre at Amaravati.
No, I think it was earlier than that.
Earlier than that.
It must have been earlier than that, because I used to come for what was the equivalent of their Easter retreat right throughout the 90s. But I think it's been a retreat centre from the beginning.
And the articulation of that is that the retreat center looks after so-called training of lay people in Buddhist
Yes. So
Buddhist practice, and the monastic look after their own and offer Dhamma talks. How is the articulation detailed?
part of it is the significant difference that in the West, a lot of people who are interested in Buddhism have not been born Buddhist, but they take it up on the basis of that they're interested in enlightenment in relation to their own being. Whereas in many Asian countries or the home countries of Theravada Buddhism, the practice for lay people is encouraged as generosity, meditation, morality,
and devotion.
Not in that order.
Yes. And devotion as well. So the monastic place.
Generosity, yes.
Yeah, generosity.
I probably said it wrong, but anyway, generosity, morality, generosity, and meditation.
Yes.
So
with a strong aspect of devotion as well. So the coming, and it's the usually in the East, the monasteries are like, between brackets, social clubs, in the sense that people can go and gathering women. It's also a safe place to go and chat.
Yes.
It's a counseling area, sometimes chatting with a monk.
Yes.
Yes. So you were more on the lay side, and you were getting more in the early 2000s. You were getting more involved in the actual so-called management of monastery, or how did it work?
I was in the early 2000s. Had been a trustee at Harnham for quite a long time, but in 2003 I finally got it together to give up my life in the north of England, which I'd been there for 27 years or something, and moved down to Hemel Hempstead, which is the town near the monastery. And then the following year after that, I moved into the monastery.
So you were not only serving and working for the Sangha, but you also coming and live on the monastery ground. For those who might not necessarily have an idea of that would mean, how is it to be a lay long-term resident on the same grounds with Monastic Sangha, with having an office, sharing the same kitchen grounds, working? For those who've done it, we have an idea what it would mean, or those who have maybe visited and stayed at those monasteries several times in a row, we can have a sense of what it means. But when you actually also doing it, that's basically your life. It's a life choice. So you have given up the idea of ordaining, and you just give up everything else and come and live in the monastery. Can you elaborate a bit on that? I'm very curious.
For me, it was a very, very joyful thing, because it had been a long time coming, in a sense. I'd got such an established place in my job and life in Newcastle, and it just took me a long time to let go of all of it. And I haven't got any children, but I also don't have many other peers in my family. So all my adult life I've been pretty independent.
Right.
So to get all my ducks lined up, to get it together to move back to the south of England, come here, was quite a big thing. So when I did it, I was really happy, and it felt like now I can go full time in the direction that, in a sense, the heart is already going.
Yes.
The life had been acting like a brake on me. So I was, my main thing was not to come as a gardener or the librarian or what have you, but to come to be able to practice full time. And I think that's possibly different to other people who are just coming to the practice new, because you can come here brand new to the practice as long as you can tolerate community life and meditating a couple of times a day.
Yes.
So I just embedded myself in all the practices that I was aware of.
So that would mean that you follow the routine.
Yes.
You follow the routine of the monastery, you follow the routine of the monks and the nuns.
Yes.
You share space.
Yes.
But following the routines means attending the pujas
twice a day. 8 precepts.
8 precepts, living on 1 meal a day and breakfast porridge in the morning, and having your office and serving the Sangha during the day and having some rest, but mainly living a life of partial seclusion in your case, because you're living on a monastery ground, but you're still allowed in and out. You don't really have. Did you have to report to anyone your ins and outs? No. And were there other persons with you, or were you the only one? Were you the only? How many lay long-term residents were there in those years when you came in?
There were fewer than there are now, but there were 4 women on the female long-term lay resident corridor, which there still are. There's a bit of an overspill, or there has been. So, and the sense of it was that it was a serious place of practice for people who had an awareness of what that offered. Sometimes there were potential anagarikars living on our corridor as well. So the atmosphere there was pretty much a dedicated atmosphere.
Right.
I assumed that everybody was on 8 precepts, and what that indicates really is that the focus is really on liberation.
So you basically not wanting to ordain, not ordaining, but living as though, or as
in
though
a sense,
ordaining,
as much
because
as I could.
Yeah.
The difference is that as a lay person, you don't have the patimokkha or its female equivalent, so you don't have an opportunity to talk with other members of that formal opportunity to talk with other members of the Sangha about unskillful behaviour, and to reaffirm your commitment.
What about training then?
You do once it was fortnightly then, but you do take the precepts, reinforce your commitment to the precepts every week in the temple on the moon day.
Right.
But the training was slightly different then. There was no real sense of training the lay people, but I had tea fairly often with individual nuns in particular. There were monks and nuns around, so I would talk to them. There was a monk in the office, and I was the transport coordinator working in the office sometimes, because I was the librarian as well. There were monks and nuns on a library committee, so I got to know them quite well.
Yeah.
And there was also quite a regular practice of the lay people meeting with one of the monks or nuns at tea time, and we developed the practice of reading one of the suttas. And then discussing whatever came up.
Which is basically what they do for themselves amongst the monastic. They have those type of. You were invited to some specific sessions.
Yes, so we had lay people. It was just called tea, having tea with the bhikkhu or something. It wasn't sort of called training or what have you. But that combined with the fact that I was the librarian, surrounded by all these holy books, just meant that I could really immerse myself for years and years in the teachings. And I hardly had to talk to anybody.
Yeah.
Which for me was fantastic.
A life of a lay monastic. Almost a life of a lay monastic.
One thing that I didn't mention in this chronology was that I had finished the training as a psychotherapist, so I qualified, you see. So, and I took a year or two to integrate that, because it's quite a big deal. For me, it was a big deal. And I'd been introduced to a lot of ideas that I couldn't integrate at all, really, very easily with Buddhism. And that was quite a big subject amongst Buddhists. And some of it waffles around about the nature of the self and that kind of thing. And that would have been the key problematic area if you're a psychotherapist who wants to practice Vipassana meditation, or is practicing Vipassana meditation. And but during that, the library was full of books that were helpful about that. So I just carried on with that exploration.
And you had a chance to have privilege, no, maybe very special rapport with some of monastics who are now considered elders in the tradition, at the first hand access to the source of how can I put it, Ajahn Chah's legacy in the UK, and that's it's quite unique, no? It's quite unique.
There probably are other people around, but it's useful to remember that most people are orientated towards families,
right?
And that keeps them outside of living in monasteries.
So that in
your I'm not,
and you're not, yeah,
and,
exactly.
And I realized in 1993 or something like that I was finished with intimate sexual personal relationships. So that shaped, not in a deliberate kind of a way, but it just frees up a lot of time and attention if you're not in that kind of relationship. Celibacy was one of the things that made the connection with the Monastic Sangha unique and very useful. You know, there are lots of spiritual teachings in other traditions and other religions that are very valuable, and I've got a lot from. But in these monasteries, you get, as a long-term lay resident, you get the celibacy of monasticism along with literally thousands of years of spiritual wisdom.
Yes, yes, yes.
So, yes. And I was born in 1954. So all of the Sangha members, apart from Long Paul, of my, well, there's a whole lot of baby boomers, basically, and I'm in with them. And because I've had a connection with a lot together of them over the years, we've all just aged and aged and aged, as we do.
Yes, 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 yes. So you've seen Amaravati change and transform, and at the same time you have had a sense that maybe in your own almost 20 years, next year will be 20 years, or this year maybe it's
this
already
year.
This year is the 20th year of living at Amaravati. It's not just a home, it's not just a family, it's a whole spiritual trail that you've built for yourself, where there's a lot of things seems to be coming together and falling into place naturally. I feel that there are it seems like you have had very little tensions in doing this. It's like unfolding naturally with your training outside as a psychotherapist, with your possible ordination, with your serving the Sangha for what it needs in terms of things, really practical administrative things to be done, plus the financial aspect, the trustee of the steward organization. That's a lot, Caroline. And at the same time, it feels like it's been unfolding quite naturally for you. But would you give us I think we're nearing towards the end of the conversation, but it often occurs to me to hear, I would say, opinions on what it means to live as a lay person, as following precepts. So those precepts, especially the 5 and 8 first precepts, are actually common to both monastics and lay person. So
not quite, because the sexual one changes.
The sexual one changes from trying to have appropriate behavior if you are on 5 precept, and if you're on 8 precept is a recommendation for celibacy. And
well, for a monastic it's a requirement. But
yes, yeah. But as for the lay person, I think it's formulated as not taking any intentional sexual activity. So I've often heard people saying, "Oh, there's a lot to let go of. It can be quite constraining, or maybe even people who don't know much about the tradition. But eventually, I've heard as well some monastics' perspective on it, where it says if you think about a precept in terms of something that you don't have to think about it, it removes a number of suffering from you. If you're not killing anything, that area of your life is okay. It's just pay attention of not killing something, and then there are rules that change from the tradition. So the second one comes in, so not taking that which is not given, which means not stealing, in other words, but it's a bit. So if you think about this, it's not a constraint, you just don't take it, and it removes another area of suffering. So would you say it worked like that for you? It just facilitated your life in the monastery for being on 8 precepts. You didn't feel any constraint. You didn't come across as a prohibition about doing something. Can you see something about the precepts?
The precepts are a voluntary undertaking, and they were very joyful to me because and they still are, because I'd done quite a lot in the psychological field. I did think, yes, these are moral precepts, and there are echoes here of what thousands of people do in relation to 12-step programs, actually. One of the things that people do with the 12-step program, which I've never seriously been in, although I've known about it, is undertake a fearless inventory of one's own behaviour.
Fearless inventory of one's own behaviour. That's very, very nicely put.
There are lots of useful things in 12-step programs, I think, for all sorts of people. That gave me a sense right from the very beginning that you can understand the 5 precepts in layers and layers and layers and layers. And as you meditate and clean up your act, you have more and more ability to have those layers revealed to you. And yes, we live in a society where you're not supposed to be killing people, and lying is never considered to be a good thing, generally, really. So you can understand them at that basic level. A lot of them will take you straight into things like the question of desire. What is the nature of desire? Do you even want to do these things? If you want to smell a flower, are you taking something, receiving something? You can really use that as that kind of contemplation as the basis of considering the relationship between you as a being and all other phenomena in the world. And it's the same, and it was the same when I examined, for instance, sexual behaviour. So there was layer upon layer upon layer, and there are basic things in the monastery, like really, if you're on 8 precepts, you shouldn't wear, as a layperson, you shouldn't wear earrings, for instance, and jewellery of any kind. And that wasn't a problem for me, but there are all sorts of ways in which you can discover that your own psychology is eroticized. And whenever you're coming out of that, aspects of it are, whenever you're coming out of that, then you're undertaking sexual behaviour, indulging in sexual behaviour. And you don't see that at first. You really have to have that kind of body and mind that's like a radio receiver and a radio transmitter, that's very sensitive, and for most people is the result of a lot of meditation.
I've had recently, in his recent interview with a nun who has disrobed, she spoke quite frequently, and she repeated quite frequently about coming into living in a well, she was part of a monastic order, but she said suddenly you realize, just by the fact of not having choices, but you've chosen that path, but then you realize, there's no choices, even in terms of monastery, no choices for the food, no choices for the kind of clothing, sometimes I have to ask permission to a number, sometimes it's even permission, do you mind if I open the door? Things like that. So the minimal, little microscopic little layer of conditioning. She kept speaking about conditioning, and you are constantly reflected your own conditioning, because when you live in a community which seems to be large, I mean, we talk in Amaravati, we're talking now these days between monastics and lay long-term resident, we are talking for about 60, 50, 50,
50 to 60,
50,
yeah.
50 60 person, or anyhow, there also are guests and visitors, but guests staying over. Somehow and you kind of fed back this, your conditioning. You're not at the moment, though, sometimes you're not expecting it. And so you're constantly on this mirroring. And well, in her case, it was different. But I hear that from you as well, that it's, you become more and more aware, provided that you are willing to go in that direction, to see your own conditioning, and then you can start peeling off the layers and eventually lighten up the practice, and eventually not see the precepts as being, in case it was before, earlier, not seeing them as constrictions, but rather as liberation and freedom from attachment to certain types of cravings, or certain types. So you have had a life quite rich in that sense. If you were to now wrap it up for us, and you will summarize. It's very difficult, because I imagine that we could keep on going this conversation for hours. There's a lot that could be said, and at the same time, that's also only part of maybe your biography one day, Caroline. But it's rich, and at the same time, we also know that enrichment is not necessarily something that a term that is often used in spiritual practice. We all talk more about letting go and relinquishing rather than accumulating. But what I meant there is more insightful, very insightful life. And is obviously, Caroline today is not Caroline that came in 40 years ago in Arnhem. But if you could wrap up a bit all this container full of experiences and spiritual, I think the wholeness of your life has just been an enormous spiritual trail. Would you be able to wrap it up in a few words? Meaningful words for people of all walks of life. And because it's also very particular tradition, this one, the Thai forest tradition, is one of the most, where austerity is really part of the training, I would say, or austerity is part of the way of life. So that would include a reminder when we need to purchase equipment, purchase basic essentials for the functioning of the monastery, trying to reuse resources, including environmental resources, so trying to replant trees. So this austerity, this caring, this wisdom, this holistic view that we are part of an enormous bulb that's called humanity and connected with the universe. This is being to practice in every day of your life, because you've been not so much out of the monastery. You're pretty much in quite for 4 decades almost. So it must be very difficult if asking you to wrap it up, but I'm sure you can find some words for those who don't know.
Clearly, if you look back at my history, you would have to just put one foot in front of the other and keep going, wouldn't you? Because I have changed. I do feel much freer than I ever did as a young person. Of course, it's difficult to know how I would have turned out if I hadn't ever come across the practice. You know, what I would have done. I think the thing for me was finding a spiritual path that worked, in the sense of addressing where this particular being needed to be.
And this particular being meaning Caroline.
Yes,
Yes.
this Caroline.
And so there's also a sense of duty, but also a sense of service, selfless service.
Yes, I get so much from it. I don't really think about
in
that
terms
much.
of-
I'm not really very aware of it.
Yeah. It flows naturally.
The practice for me is very joyful.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So service is joyful. The joy is not obfuscated by the day-to-day irritations.
So you seem to be in your own element.
Yes, and I seem to feel I'm in the right place.
In the right place.
Yes. And of course, that's a great privilege, and I consider myself very lucky.
Is there a quote? Is there a quote that really comes to mind? Aside just not the foot in front of the other. Could be of the Dhammapada, it could be from Ajahn Amaro, yeah. Could be from Luang Por, can be just a quote.
On the morning that I went into work and handed in my resignation when I was in Newcastle, I had been sitting in front of my shrine and I saw a quote on a calendar from Ajahn Chah, which did not quite say what I'm going to say, but it more or less did. What I remember was, when wisdom awakes, truth is all there is.
When wisdom awakes,
truth
is all there is. Isn't that beautiful?
And so then I just knew that my life in that ordinary job, so to speak, had finished. It was actually already dead, even though I hadn't resigned, because the heart wasn't there.
Thank you, Caroline. Really.
Thank you.
I don't think this interview gives all due respect to your rich experience, but who knows, maybe we'll cross path again, because I'm not staying I won't be very far somehow in the realm of Dhamma. So thank you for your space and time.
Thank you.